Thanks, everyone. I'm excited to be here. This is so fun for me to talk about this subject. Before I dive in, I actually would love to know from you all, who here, raise your hand if you have made your own fermented foods before. Awesome. I'm curious, who here has fermented maybe sauerkraut or lacto-fermented vegetables? What about kombucha or kefir? Yogurt? Awesome. Anybody made bread? All right, perfect. Okay, so on my Guts and Glory podcast at summerbock.com, I ask my guests, what do you think is the main cause for the decline in gut health worldwide right now? And I've spent years really looking at this subject myself. I run various programs in my company. I teach people all about gut rebuilding. I talk to them about how to get friendly bacteria to grow in your body and get rid of yeasts and bad bacteria. I also run a probiotic power cleanse, and this is a 10-day food-based cleanse. It's really easy. It's just like a simple way to get back in touch with your body, listening and trusting what you already know, but also, again, providing the right environment for the right bacteria to grow. And then I also do a year-long fermentation certification program. And this is where we talk how to use fermented foods as medicine. And we're really just trying to explore this whole concept of food outside of the place of marketing. And we'll kind of get into that a little bit later, like talking about reading labels and some of the confusion that comes up around fermented foods and marketing and labeling. So all my programs are online. I try to make everything accessible to people. So if you have internet access, you can access this information. I started out pretty sick through this whole journey. I had multiple chemical sensitivity. I was really struggling with food allergies. There was a point in time where there was only 30 foods that I could eat without having a reaction. And so, I would be basically sitting down and developing a ton of anxiety before every meal because I didn't know how I was going to react to that meal. I was struggling with panic attacks 3 to 5 times a week. I would wake up in the middle of the night sometimes with a panic attack, like heart racing 188 beats per minute. And I just didn't know what was going on. I had environmental allergies, I had rashes, and I was just overwhelmed. And I was trained as an herbalist, so I had all my tinctures lined up. I would take various things for the environmental allergies. I was taking tinctures for adrenal support because I was exhausted. My body was getting worn out from being sick. I was taking stuff for digestion. I was taking herbs for every little thing, like my liver. I wanted to clear up allergies, so let's clean out the liver. And then there reached this point where I was so sick that I showed up at my doctor's office again. And she goes, "Summer, what are you doing here?" I'm like, I need your help. And she goes, "But you know more about this than I do." I was, basically working with her patients as a health coach, helping them with their diet and figuring out their lives. And so whenever she was stumped, she would send people over to me and I would help them out. I still couldn't figure out my stuff, but I knew how to help people be healthy. And so when she looked at me and said that, she goes, "Summer, here's what's going to happen. I'm going to write a prescription. You're not going to take it. I don't think it's going to do anything anyway, so what are you doing here?" I'm like, awesome. So I leave the doctor's office that day, and on one hand, I was terrified because I felt like my last stop. There was like allopathic medicine, the people who were there for you when none of the alternative stuff works. That kind of failed me that day. But on the other hand, she really helped me because I let go of trying to have somebody else save me in that moment. And I started learning how to trust my own body and trust what I needed. And it was shortly after that I decided, I made a very, very clear decision that I was going to cure myself of allergies. And that's really where it starts. And just for all of you, wherever you're headed in your healing journey, it's always going to start with that very clear decision. So that meant I kind of had to reconsider everything I was doing. So I looked at all of the issues. I took total control of my health, full responsibility. And as I did more research, I realized that all these health concerns that I had been dealing with were all stemming from my gut. So I took a temporary hiatus from all the herbs. and I really just focused on gut health. And I learned that I needed to add more probiotics. And so, as an herbalist, I wanted to know, what is the whole food version of probiotics? How did my ancestors get probiotics into their diet? Because I'm sure that they weren't taking probiotic supplements, like little popping pills, with every meal that was made in the laboratory. They had to get it somehow. And if this was something that my body was missing, and this is something that somehow was making me this sick, this has to be accessible in an easy way for people throughout history. So I discovered through more research that there are some foods, some amazing fermented foods that have all kinds of live organisms, probiotics, and not only do they have probiotics, they have amazing healing attributes as well. So let's, for one moment, talk about how you kind of get to this issue of the decline of gut health. I think there's three main causes. I think that it comes from antibiotics. And there are studies that show now that when you take antibiotics, every single time you take them, your ability to regrow your flora back to its native environment is lessened after every single time. And so then there's people out there like me who have taken antibiotics, I don't even know, definitely at least 20 times. I was taking them 3 to 5 times a year for a while. And then there are nutrient deficient foods. So not getting enough nutrition and not feeding the right bacteria. So processed foods, chemicalized foods, junk foods. I grew up on Taco Bell and Mountain Dew. I don't know about you, but this stuff is prevalent in our society. And then the third factor that leads to dysbiosis is stress. And stress has some good parts. I mean, you all know that. Like when you're doing yoga or exercise, you are stressing your body in a positive way. Your body adapts, it grows with that stress. But then if you have chronic stress all the time, it's actually terrible because you're not ever allowing your body to enter a state of rest and restore. So if you can't get in a state of rest and restore, combine that with antibiotics, combine that with decades of nutrient deficient foods, and then, combine that with the fact that there are no organisms living in somebody's body who's been dealing with these three factors. They are totally deficient. And that's how you kind of set it up. And so what happens is once you've cleaned out all of the good bacteria using the antibiotics and the stress and the nutrient deficient foods, it basically turns what was once a lush rainforest with tons of different kinds of communities of organisms growing, it turns it into a desert. We're like, oh, okay, so let's everybody take probiotics. But that's kind of just like throwing apple seeds at the desert and being like, come on, grow. I'll just keep throwing more apple seeds and maybe they'll eventually grow here. But that's not really how it works. So when it comes to what's going on in your gut, if you end up with the wrong bacteria in there and the wrong yeasts and all of these organisms that shouldn't be living there, you are going to be feeding a whole metropolis of bacteria, trillions and trillions of bacteria. And they eat everything you eat and then they excrete. And part of the magic of our digestive system is that we have this intimate relationship with the environment. We can allow food and nutrients from our environment to pass right into our body, and then we turn that into the building blocks of everything that makes us our bodies. It's really amazing. But the downfall to that magic is that when you have the wrong bacteria in there, they're hanging out, eating and excreting, and those excretions pass through that same layer, through that same intestinal wall, right into the bloodstream. So all of that toxicity starts running through the bloodstream. It gets filtered by the liver, clogs up the liver, and then you become the human sewer for this entire metropolis of bacteria. And it's pretty gross, and it's really hard for people who are struggling with that. And you may have struggled with that yourself. That might be why you're here today. Or you may know other people who struggle with these issues. And there's so many issues. We can think of the digestive issues like Crohn's, IBS, inflammatory bowel disease, even just constipation, diarrhea, gas, bloating. These are all issues connected to gut health and to this human sewer situation. But there are extra intestinal diseases as well. And those are going to include diabetes, that will include autoimmune disease, even just being immunocompromised, like having a weak immune system. Obesity, being overweight, allergic, asthmatic, these are all connected to the gut. And it's so fascinating that here we have these diseases that don't even really seem like they are. But that's when I realized from my own healing journey, that's what really helped me. I was like, oh, right, all this stuff is connected. So when I focused on the gut, I focused on a few main things. I focused on cleansing and rebuilding. I wanted to cleanse out the bad bacteria, cleanse out the toxicity from those organisms, and then rebuild using nutrition, rebuild using fermented foods, using probiotics, using herbs and supplements. And so today I'm really gonna delve into some of the fermented foods that you can eat to do this, to help rebuild the system. There are so many other things to do to rebuild. You have to figure out how to get your body in a state of rest and restore, emotional detox. You have to figure out how to get your pH right, do more nutrient building through the rest of your diet. There are so many other factors. We're not gonna get into that today, but we are just gonna focus on the fermented foods that you can do and like how much to take, what are my favorites, and I'm even gonna share with you some of my not so favorite fermented foods. Hopefully I won't make you cry. So, the three main ways, 3 is like my favorite number for this whole talk. I was like, 3, there's 3 of everything. My 3 favorite ways to rebuild the gut really, again, are to build nutrition. And you do that through food, obviously, but nutrient-dense foods as well as probiotics and probiotic-rich foods. You also do that through herbs and supplements to help support the body's natural systems. Very important. And then you also do it through detoxification on all levels. You want to detoxify on all levels. Physically, emotionally, mentally, all of it. Your environment as well. All right, so let's jump in and talk about some of these fermented foods. My absolute favorite of all is lacto-fermented veggies. Now, I love lacto-fermented veggies because not only are they filled with the lactobacillus, which is the most common beneficial bacteria, but lacto-fermented veggies, which include sauerkraut and kimchi, also contains lactic acid. And a lot of people get confused about this word lactic. Like, does it mean dairy, like lactose? It doesn't. It's connected in the terms that, like, when lactose is broken down, it creates lactic acid. That's where that connection comes in. But there is no dairy when you're making sauerkraut or kimchi. And when you go to buy sauerkraut or kimchi, you want to look at the labels, and there's a few things you have to look for. It has to be in the refrigerated section. It needs to say cultured or unpasteurized. This is really important because once you've pasteurized it, you've killed off any of those organisms. It's no longer going to be useful for you. So that's really key. The other thing is look at the ingredient label, make sure there is no vinegar. Vinegar will kill the probiotics as well, so this cannot be a vinegar ferment. You want to make sure that there's no sugar or other preservatives in it. It really should only be salt, vegetables, and spices, and that's it. And when you find it in the refrigerated section, that shows us that it is more likely to be unpasteurized, but you need to see those words on the label. There are still some sauerkraut sitting out there in the refrigerated section that have been flash pasteurized. So check carefully, learn about the company, and one of the best ways is to go to the farmer's market and find people who are making their own sauerkraut or kimchi. You should eat 2 forkfuls starting out, like 2 forkfuls with a meal. And then you can work your way up to 2 forkfuls every single meal. Over the course of a week, you kind of want to ramp up slowly because you're bringing in all these new organisms. In the final product of sauerkraut or kimchi, you have 13 different probiotics present. And what's crazy, so I actually have a video to share with you guys if you want to learn how to make it. It's at summerbock.com/wanderlust. So you can go there. I'll also send around a piece of paper for you to write down your email, and I can give you access to that. And I'll give you access to the notes for anything I talk about today as well. But what is truly interesting to me about this is like 13 different probiotics. And you basically started out with salt and vegetables, chop them all up, smash them down in a crock, and that's what you end up with a few weeks later. We're not adding a starter culture. And in fact, that's one of the things I want you to look for. I generally prefer to use a sauerkraut or kimchi that doesn't have a starter culture added, because then we know we're getting the 13 different strains of probiotics that you were meant to be eating. This is how it has been traditionally made. My second favorite ferment to eat is kefir. And kefir this is an interesting one because many of you think you've had kefir, but when you go to the store and you check out the kefir that's in the refrigerated section at the store, it isn't kefir. I'm sorry to say. It's a kefir-like beverage. It's still delicious. It still has probiotics in it. It still is easier to digest than regular milk. But the kefir that's been rigorously studied that shows amazing healing attributes is made from a little gelatinous cauliflower-looking starter culture. And you take some milk, you plop the starter culture in there, you let it sit for 24 to 48 hours, and then you have this amazing beverage. It's been fermented, so it's been broken down to where the sugars are easier to digest, even the fats are easier to digest, the proteins are more assimilable. So I hate to break it to you, but going out to the store and getting that kind of kefir is not quite the right way to do it. You need to look for somebody who has access to these kefir grains. And what's fascinating about these kefir grains is that we can't make them ourselves as humans. So the kefir grains, when you get your hands on them, sometimes you can find them online. There's various stores that sell them. There's online groups like on Facebook and other places where people will give them to you for free. They'll, you pay for shipping or whatever, and they'll mail them to you because they multiply pretty crazy once you start growing them. I think if you've seen kombucha, it's similar. It's like this little organism that's passed around. But if you get your hands on kefir, the fascinating thing is this has been passed around for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. You are getting something that humans cannot make, and that we keep handing off to another person, passing it down for generations and generations. And the benefit historically was that it helped preserve the milk. It helped this food last longer that was incredibly nutritious for people. And you can make it with other things besides milk. You can do it with coconut milk, almond milk, things like that. But kefir, hands down, one of my absolute favorite ones. In Russia, this is what babies eat. This is their first food after breast milk. And it's been shown to help replenish the bacteria in your gut after a round of antibiotics. So I'm kind of talking about doing some of this stuff at home because it's important to me when I think about what happens when you actually make these foods. So I'm really going to push each of you here to consider making either sauerkraut or kimchi or getting your hands on some kefir grains and making this at home. And the reason is again, I have three main things that I want you to take away here to help you really understand that there's a lot of confusion around food. There's a lot of confusion around probiotics. And so one of the things I want you to think about is when you make foods at home that are fermented, you have to break through all of your conditioning. You've been taught that everything should be sterile, like you should sterilize the kitchen. You've been taught that maybe you should even sterilize these jars and all the utensils that you're using before you make the fermented foods. Hand sterilizer, people basically rub it all over their children, trying to make sure that they're not going to contaminate each other or get sick. And I think a lot of people are aware that this isn't the right way to go, but if your refrigerator goes out for 6 or 8 or 12 hours, it's going to be really hard for you to not throw away all the stuff out of that refrigerator because that's what you've been taught. It's been sitting in the danger zone. It's been sitting in a temperature that allows bacteria to proliferate and grow. And so what I'm asking you to do when you make something fermented, I'm asking you to basically let something sit on your counter and rot for 2 weeks, up to 9 years. Miso sits for 9 years in some cases. It's beans. You let beans sit on the counter for 9 years and then you eat it. Goes against everything, and I don't care who you are or how much you think you can do this. I still get people, they text, email, call, Facebook message me, and they say, okay, can you look at it first? And I've done this before in public. I made a ferment one day that had shiitake mushrooms in it. First time I've ever fermented shiitake mushrooms, or any mushrooms. And I was at Brighton Bush Hot Springs in Oregon, and I scraped it. I've shown everybody how you do it. You scrape off the top. Sometimes it's moldy. So you have to scrape through a layer of mold. Gross. So you do that, and you're like, all right. And I dig down in there, and I'm in front of everybody, and and I got really scared. I was like, oh no, you guys, I'm really scared. And I just told them what was going on. And I really was terrified. I was like, what if these mushrooms are poisonous? What if when they fermented, some chemical reaction happened and now I'm gonna die? And this was a great talk, but now I'm not even gonna be here to know if they liked it. And that was like my whole thought process. And I've been there many times when I've made new ferments, but I am asking you to try to make your own ferments so that you can go through this experience yourself, because it is magical. Once you break through this and you try something, and I see the people in here who raise their hands that they've actually made fermented foods, they're really chuckling because they know, they've been there. But what you do through that process is you learn how to trust your body. You learn how to trust your senses. And that's part of what I said earlier, making a decision, reclaiming your health, taking 100% responsibility for your health. You do that when you make fermented foods, because you have to break through your conditioning of everything you've ever been taught in order to even get to the point where you can scrape that off and eat it. The second thing I want you to look at is history and tradition. Like I said, what did your ancestors eat from fermented foods? What were people eating 1,000 years ago? Look at history and tradition when making decisions around food. Very, very important. And then the third thing is look at studies. Look at both sides. You're always going to see the studies that salt is bad, salt is good, salt is bad, salt is good, salt is bad. You know, it's like every other day. And part of that is there to confuse you. So I want you to think about these three things as you're making decisions around food. Look at history. What does it say? Learn how to trust your senses, learn how to trust your body. And look at the studies, look at both sides. Be honest that you may not know the answer, or no one may know the answer really. All right, so let me just wrap up with a couple things I would like to say about my least favorite ferment. Kombucha. So kombucha is an interesting one because it's caffeine, alcohol, and sugar all wrapped up into one. It's the trifecta. It sounds good, exactly. And interestingly, historically, kombucha was drank in about 4-ounce serving sizes. And then people today are drinking these 16-ounce, like super-sized kombucha bottles. So that's something to consider. And many of the kombuchas out there actually don't have probiotics. So you would have to test it individually to find out. There are some that do, but they usually add them after the fact. So these are just things to consider. There's a reason that people get really addicted to kombucha and they want it every day and they get their little rush. I heard about a nurse recently that she was like, man, I drink a kombucha before my night shift every time. It's great. She was like an OBGYN nurse, and then her husband showed her how much alcohol content was in even the acceptable ones, and she's like, oh great, I'm getting drunk and delivering babies. No wonder I was having such a great time. So for people who have diabetes or candida, it's just something to consider. It's not my favorite one when it comes to restoring gut health. All right, thanks everyone.
How many folks here either have an autoimmune disease or know someone who has an autoimmune disease? If you could raise your hand. Or someone perhaps who has a child on the spectrum or type 2 diabetes. Can you keep your hands up, please? It's pretty striking.